Okay, hi, I'm Jen Holzer. I'm going to be presenting on doing transdisciplinary science in European long-term socio-ecological research. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Environmental Sustainability Research Center at Brock University in Canada, but pretty recently I did my PhD, which was focused on auditing long-term socio-ecological research platforms in Europe during the period 2015 to 2019. And I met some of you through that process. And in this presentation, I'll be sharing a lot of what we found from that investigation and some of the results and how some of the results have been incorporated into current ongoing projects in eLTER. So back to doing transdisciplinary science. I'm going to be talking about what is it, have we been doing it, how can we do it well, and what are steps now being taken to really make it happen. So it's well recognized that an all hands on deck approach is crucial for addressing the urgent environmental and sustainability crises of our day. And this is from a letter in Nature that came out in 2010, specifically speaking about Europe, that Europe's future hinges on funding transdisciplinary scientific collaboration. But a lot of the structures are not set up to support it. But career paths, peer recognition, publication channels, and the public funding of science are still mostly geared to maintain and reinforce disciplinarity. So the answer in many people's minds is transdisciplinarity. That's the all hands on deck approach. So what is it exactly? And what is it in the context of socio-ecological research? So it's solving problems. It's starting with the problem and designing the research to address the problem, a problem in society, in the real world. And we defined it in one of our papers that came out a few years ago as a reflexive, collaborative approach to knowledge co-production, inclusive of academic and non-academic actors and stakeholders, to integrate diverse types of knowledge, consider risks and consequences, and generate practical solutions to societal problems. And here's a graphic also from a recent article, basically using this infinity diagram to say we start in the real world. Science investigates sustainability issues and society handles the sustainability issues, but central to the process of transdisciplinary research, we have to frame what is the problem, how are we going to analyze the problem, how are we going to generate solutions that will actually work. And it's like an iterative process. You have to go back and forth, and it's very complex. And something people ask about a lot is, how is transdisciplinarity different from multi or interdisciplinarity? So quickly, multidisciplinarity, an example would be like a book on a topic, and each of the chapters in the book addresses that topic from a different disciplinary perspective. An interdisciplinary project would be when researchers from different disciplines are working together. They have some kind of collaboration. Maybe they wrote the grant proposal together, but they're still using their disciplinary knowledge to address that common problem. And transdisciplinarity is quite different because the researchers come together, maybe not just researchers, but also practitioners from society, maybe also local stakeholders or government stakeholders or whomever. That's also part of the process. It's not just scientists usually. And they sit together and come up with a new framework for how they're going to work, what problem they're going to address. Defining the problem itself can be quite difficult. And then what theories or concepts or approaches they're going to use to address the problem. So that's kind of the distinction there. And then this is how we conceptualized in our work what transdisciplinary socio-ecological research is specifically, or at least how it should be in an ideal world. So on the left, we have research and monitoring and knowledge production. Like I said, it's not just scientists, but maybe also practitioners, citizen scientists. Maybe there's local people that you're working with who are using existing knowledge or creating new knowledge that feeds directly into policy and implementation, which we see on the right. And then those people who are doing the policy and practice on the ground are figuring out what additional knowledge what else do they need to know to do their job well, and then asking those people on the left, okay, can we change the kind of knowledge that we're generating because we need to know something more, something different. And then those two those two evaluators in the center with the briefcase and the clipboard, they're coming in to evaluate the whole process. How is this working? What kind of knowledge is being generated? What kind of policies and practices are happening? And is there good communication between these two sides? And does it fit the social ecological context in general? Is it really addressing the problems? That's a much bigger kind of evaluation. So to sum up, transdisciplinary research transcends the norms of any one field, academic or practical. It's inclusive of multiple types of knowledge. The knowledge is produced by cross-disciplinary participatory teams, and it aims to understand the real world and produce knowledge that's useful for solving problems of the real world. It's characterized by complexity, both the problems, the process of doing transdisciplinary science, and usually the solutions. All aspects are pretty complex, and it's critical and self-reflexive, meaning as the process goes, it's very process oriented. The people working on the project are thinking about how well it's going and how they should adapt as they go. Okay, so what is long-term socio-ecological research? So starting with a bit of history, just a little bit. It started really in 1980 through a program funded by the National Science Foundation in the US. And over the years, through different conferences, eventually in 1992, it spread internationally. And in 1992, the International Long-Term Ecological Research Network was established. And throughout the 90s, there was this shift that emphasized the importance of looking at things in terms of social ecological systems and a more integrated vision. And finally, in 2003, eLTER, the European version, the European Long-Term Ecological Research Network, was founded. And from the very beginning, they designated certain areas for social ecological research, because there was always this sense in Europe, especially, that humans had dominated or shaped the landscape for millennia, and there was really not the same sense of wilderness and remote kind of wilderness that you have in North America, for example, as you probably know. And some other contributing factors that helped to grow and develop this network was Alternet, the biodiversity research network that was launched in 2004. And a lot of the people who worked on that were also working in eLTER. And in the US, it had now been about 20 years that the long-term ecological research program there had been in existence, and their evaluation report emphasized the importance of social research. And then later, just a few years ago, the work that our team and some others did evaluating socio-ecological research in Europe said something similar, basically. And that has really fed directly into the proposals that were written a few years ago. And socioecology is really a central gear now in eLTER PPP and eLTER Plus. So you can see on the left, here are the LTSER sites, or they're usually called platforms in Europe. They're usually larger in scale. And this is a bit blurry, but basically the idea is that they have this scientific infrastructure, sites, they're often linked with national parks. They manage, well, that's a bit more complicated, but data management, communication, they have their own set of partners. They've usually signed a memorandum of understanding with different research and other kinds of partners, and they're doing ongoing monitoring and research. And in terms of the intellectual history, that's also quite complex, but just to give a sense that all of these different fields, ecology, economics, engineering, land use, landscape ecology, geography, anthropology, sociology, and history, all fed into long-term socio-ecological research as it's practiced today. And the field of social ecology has a few different streams. Some are more focused on energy, like the socio-ecological metabolism work, and some are more about land change science or sustainability science. And usually most of the time in the LTSER network, when we're talking about socio-ecological research, we're talking about transdisciplinary science that focuses on human nature interactions. So how did we do this evaluation, where we evaluated is LTSER doing what it's supposed to do? So we basically asked, okay, socio-ecological research claims it produces knowledge more useful for policymaking and promoting sustainability. So let's go to the field and ask people, both scientists and stakeholders and land managers and others, is there added value to this approach? Are social questions being integrated into the ecological science? How are stakeholders integrated into the research process, if at all? What kinds of impacts are we seeing, and what are the challenges? And the case studies we looked at were these LTSER platforms, the Danube Delta and Brela Island in Romania, the Cairngorms LTSER in Scotland, and Doñana LTSER in Spain. And we did a participatory program evaluation, meaning we went out to each of these places, spoke to about 20 people in depth. Like I said, different scientists and land use, land managers, people who run nonprofits, different government agencies, and others. And we spoke with about 20 people at each place, and then analyzed those transcripts using qualitative methods, and drew out the main themes, the things that kept coming up again and again, and then categorized those themes, and then drew some preliminary conclusions, went back to these places and asked people, does this sound right to you? And then incorporated their feedback into the final results. So what did we learn? Okay, these are the themes the kind of general ideas that came up again and again. Doing science, integrating social research, science administration, stakeholder integration, knowledge transfer, science policy interface, environmental management, teamwork, and political context. But those are really general. It doesn't tell you too much about conclusions. So I'll just share a few. This is not exhaustive, but what we found was that social research is being integrated slowly and reluctantly into ecological research programs. So most of these LTSERs were started by scientists who have training in the natural sciences. And social science research is conducted a bit ad hoc. There was very little socioeconomic monitoring happening, if any. And we noticed some power dynamics because the social scientists had less decision-making power in terms of setting the research agenda at these platforms. Research priorities are strongly influenced by institutional and administrative factors, and that may be kind of clear to people who do science, but some interesting things that we found were that there were really platform champions, people who were working very hard, who believed in the mission of the LTSER and were driving it forward in every case. And in a lot of cases, they were being asked to do additional work without additional funding or additional staff. And they were facing the kind of difficulties and bureaucracy and institutional inertia that many of us experience in scientific institutions or universities or from national funding bodies. On the other hand, there was one interesting example at the Cairngorms LTSER where the Cairngorms National Park Authority wrote a research strategy that then informed the LTSER. So that was an interesting kind of case. Stakeholders are generally included when it's required for them to be included, but when the projects are already in process. So stakeholder inclusion is very tricky because it really should be different depending on the case and depending on the context. One issue is that there really is no protocol for when or how to do stakeholder participation. So that's difficult for a lot of scientists to figure out how to do it. And generally scientists consider other people to be stakeholders. They don't think of scientists as stakeholders, which is interesting. But the researchers were really aware of stakeholder fatigue and how much they're asking for from their stakeholders. So that's definitely a best practice. And researchers were, on the whole, a bit disappointed at how effectively knowledge was being transferred to stakeholders. And part of this is kind of the way most of the scientists we spoke to see the world. A lot of the researchers think about knowledge exchange. They think that knowledge exchange in public education is important, but kind of as a one-directional thing. Like they're the scientists and they will educate whoever, students and people in society, and hopefully change their mind to think more like them, which is, well, that's one way of seeing the world, but maybe not the ideal for transdisciplinary science. But a lot of knowledge sharing events were taking place, like lunchtime talks and conferences, ongoing informal relationships. The value of the research platforms depends significantly on the international network. So these platform champions we spoke about rely on their international community. EU funding and its requirements are especially important for countries with uncertain research funding. And again, it may seem maybe a little obvious, but challenges to platform development are really dominated by shortcomings in communication and management. And I think a lot of those issues are really trying to be addressed in this new generation of eLTER Plus and eLTER PPP. So a lot more findings, but we've covered most of these. In terms of the added value, the transdisciplinary approach provides the problem-solving orientation that can be really effective. Obviously, the idea of LTSER and promoting long-term work is really important. In terms of social science integration, there's definitely many of the people we talked to expressed a desire for more social science research. But we saw that it was integrated in kind of a piecemeal fashion, like when social scientists or a social science component of a project were needed, then they were brought in. And that created a power asymmetry between natural scientists and social scientists in many cases. And in terms of participation, these are scientific platforms. So the researchers are always initiating these kinds of joint meetings, which has pros and cons, of course. In terms of impacts, of course, there are a lot of research outputs like scientific papers and conferences and the knowledge exchange we talked about, and the platform champions taking opportunities that arise to get more funding and start new projects. And we saw a lot of exciting things happening. But there are challenges to doing transdisciplinary work. This pressure to just do useful science that has direct applications and direct impacts. And it's really difficult to define objectives and roles when there are so many different kinds of people and maybe they all have different priorities. So the metaphor we came up with here is this bicycle. So we have all the parts of the bicycle, but it's not necessarily well tuned. So the metaphor is that the frame of the bike is the research infrastructure, the platform, the equipment that the scientists need to do their work. And ideally, the person riding the bicycle, directing where it's going, are the stakeholders who are saying, okay, this is what we need in our community, or this is what we need, at whatever scale is appropriate. The front wheel is the ecological research and monitoring, and the back wheel is social-ecological research, social research and monitoring. And then the gears and the pedals are the research team that keep everything going. And the chain is that platform champion who's playing that leadership role and driving things forward, continuing to apply for funding and all that kind of really important stuff. And the oil that keeps the bike going is the funding itself. And then don't forget about the brakes on the bike to pause and reflect and assess how are we doing and what should we change in this kind of process that needs constant adaptation. So how are these findings, how have these findings just in the last, I don't know, 2-3 years since we looked into this, started changing European LTSER? Well, what makes an LTSER successful? So this is kind of taking our findings and framing them in the positive. Charismatic individuals, we spoke a lot about that, who have institutional support, who are driving things forward. The participatory framework, for example, at the Romanian LTSERs, there's a designated social scientist who maintains relationships with local communities, which is really important because when you want to ask someone for something, it's much better, of course, if you have an existing relationship with them. Stakeholder buy-in. In the Cairngorms LTSER, like I said, the head of the Cairngorms National Park Authority is one of the 5 co-directors of the LTSER and has really been, well, he and his predecessor have really been champions for doing research and the importance of research for the national park. The long-term nature of the ecological and socio-ecological monitoring, the responsiveness of the LTSER platform. So also in the Cairngorms, they decided at a meeting that I attended when I was interviewing people there, that people didn't really know what the LTSER was or what it was supposed to do. So they created a survey to ask people what they knew about the LTSER and sent it out to a lot of people. And just that simple thing helped to get the word out pretty significantly, and people gave really good feedback about that. So it could just be small things like that. And recognition within regional, national, and international networks. Like we said, those are really important for, especially for the scientists, but also for like knowledge sharing, getting important lessons learned, communicated from different people so they don't have to recreate the wheel. So the recommendations we came up with are to really clearly articulate and publicize the mission, objectives, and expectations of what the LTSER is trying to do. And then to figure out which kind of people you need to do the different tasks, because there's, it's not just doing science, it's also a lot of science communication, it's also a lot of management, and also a lot of interfacing with different stakeholders and partners and local people. So everyone can't do everything. So defining people's roles is really important. Aligning goals for research and observation. So usually there aren't like infinite funds for doing research and for doing the ongoing monitoring. So if funds run low in one of those pots, maybe the other, if the goals are kind of aligned, then you can kind of borrow as funds run low for things. That was just one thing that we noticed when we were talking to people about funding. Improving knowledge exchange and the accessibility of findings. So first of all, emphasizing that it's a knowledge exchange and it's not just one directional, and making findings really accessible. So not just writing scientific papers, but other kinds of short reports, or just talking informally to people in the field to explain what your science has shown and what it could mean for them. To involve social scientists and community leaders and administrators into the platform management to make it more relevant for society. To understand and define the target scales for projects and people. That's always true, but we saw a lot of examples of where it could have been done better. And initiate structured periodic evaluation. So if we have goals and then we're measuring ourselves against our goals, then we can just feel really clear about what we're achieving and what needs to change. And those findings were, I think, I mean, it's a very early stage to say, but those fed directly into the proposals that were written for the current eLTER projects, taking a kind of a vision of integration of the social and ecological aspects of the work and a transdisciplinary approach, that they're integral to project development, and that stakeholders, non-scientists should be integrated at every spatial scale, and that should be required. that there's an ethics committee and a stakeholder integration committee, that social scientists are integrated into all the key committees, and the grand environmental challenges that the LTSER are trying to address are really clearly stated. And there's an emphasis, and it's been written down clearly, like what the links will be in terms of how science will feed directly into making policy and making change in the real world. And of course, there's a danger of people going back to old habits always, but that's why it's really helpful that it's written down, and that a clear framework is being created. So what's different? These things are being institutionalized, basically. So there are a few socio-ecological case studies that are being used to hopefully demonstrate the utility of the research infrastructure for doing transdisciplinary socio-ecological research. I didn't talk much about data collection, but there's a lot of work being done in terms of how data collection can be systematic and harmonized across the network. As I said, all of these commitments and these visions are documented clearly, and therefore the network will be accountable to the European research community. And there are built-in evaluation mechanisms for socioeconomic impact assessment, and ethics guidelines, and these kinds of things that are really important. So basically, it's a really hard job to link science and society, to make science really relevant. And it takes a lot of extra time and extra effort, and everyone can't do every aspect of it. So it helps, first of all, that a lot of these things are being institutionalized, and there are requirements for them, and hopefully additional funding and people time that's going to come with that. But it's still going to be a challenge, and it's still going to require a lot of creativity and adaptation, and using teams effectively. So to go with the bike metaphor, there really is this slow uphill bike ride, is this paradigm shift that's happening in terms of adopting transdisciplinary science in European LTSER. And I think that follows the trend toward transdisciplinarity like across the board. I think driven by the urgency and importance of addressing the environmental and sustainability challenges of our day. It's not like other paradigm shifts that were stimulated by a scientific discovery, but there's just this urgent need based in society. So thank you very much. Here are some of the wonderful people in the European LTER and LTSER. Here are some of the publications that we wrote when we were doing our evaluation. And please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you so much.